Hello everybody. The key point of contention between Azerbaijan and Armenia regarding the conclusion of a peace deal today is that Azerbaijan, in a very steadfast fashion, demands that Armenian Constitution containing territorial claims against Azerbaijan must be changed, and Armenia finds this request somewhat disturbing, claiming that this is an attempt by Azerbaijan to interfere in Armenia's internal affairs. Plus, Armenia is saying that there will be a treaty provision in line with which no party will be able to refer to its domestic legislation in order to obviate its obligations emanating from the treaty. My guest today is former UK Ambassador to Azerbaijan, His Excellency James Sharp, with whom I intend to discuss wider issues related to Azerbaijan and Armenian context, also connectivity in the South Caucasus, Central Asia, and plus COP29 related matters too. Your Excellency, welcome to Caliber.
Thank you very much indeed. Good to be here and good to meet you again.
Thank you very much indeed. So let's start with the constitutional matters. Azerbaijani demand is accepted by many people as being perfectly legitimate. But what do you think? Is this a reasonable request from Azerbaijan at this juncture? And what have you made of the Armenian replies made to that effect?
I've seen discussion about this issue. I mean, first of all, I think you have to put it in the context of all the positive steps that have taken place over recent weeks and recent months. I mean, I know just very, very recently the Russian peacekeepers finally left Karabakh, which I remember in 2020 when the peace deal, the ceasefire deal was agreed, how much opposition there was in Azerbaijan to having Russian peacekeepers on Azerbaijani territories. I think that's a big, big plus in what's happened. Also, of course, the border demarcation, the first border demarcation between the two countries, I think has been very, very important. And the exchanges are continuing exchanges on the peace treaty itself. So all of these are very positive steps. And the fact that they're taking place bilaterally as well, I think is also very positive without the need for facilitators or mediators. Clearly, it's a tricky stage now with what's happening in Armenia. The political situation there is pretty sensitive. And we just need to see how things go in Armenia. But I think that's part of the context for the latest discussion about the constitutional amendment. I think that in itself, you could say that these sorts of things deserve to be discussed. I mean, as part of the peace deal for Northern Ireland, called the Good Friday Agreement, or more formally the Belfast Agreement in 1998, the Republic of Ireland did agree to change its constitution to drop its territorial claim to Northern Ireland, which of course is British. But that was part of a much broader set of negotiations and agreements. And the point there was that many compromises by the Irish government, by the British government, and by the parties in Northern Ireland themselves have brought all the sides together for this huge and very wide-ranging and historical agreement. So it kind of feels to me that, as I say, in itself, it could be one element, and it could well be one element, a constitutional change. But clearly it's a very sensitive issue in Armenia. And I think that, particularly given the situation at the moment, it's not very helpful for either side to put out maximal positions. For one side, a demand, which you refer to, isn't necessarily helpful, and the other side to refuse and reject isn't necessarily helpful either. So I think that just the process of negotiation just needs to go on, recognising the sensitivities. And it kind of feels to me that the best thing that can happen right now would be to show more progress on the peace negotiations or on border delimitation and border demarcation, which then gives sort of succour and, if you like, and support to the Armenian government in showing the population there that actually negotiations with Azerbaijan are yielding progress.
Azerbaijani position regarding this matter appears to be very clear. As President Aliyev said a couple of times, that without constitutional changes, peace treaty will not be viable. And we also understand that it is quite risky for Pashinyan to go for a referendum because he may lose a referendum. And there's also another question, of course. You're a retired diplomat and you're privy to the nitty-gritty details of the law of treaties, international law. And the question there is that if you sign something, first of all, ratification in Armenia could prove to be quite problematic because recognizing Azerbaijan's territorial integrity is not in line with their constitution. And assuming that they manage to ratify it at some point later, question is whether those replacing Pashinyan later could question the validity of this treaty, because we have seen signs of it over the past 30 years regarding the Almaty Declaration and some kind of mental gymnastics regarding the Karabakh issue. You're not privy to the discussions yourself, you're a former diplomat, but do you think sides will be able to come to some kind of compromise solution which will gratify Azerbaijani demands, also will be doable from the Armenian perspective?
I would hope so. I don't, I think it's possible. As I say, both sides seem to put out maximal positions, which and publicly, which isn't necessarily helpful.
Sure.
And clearly for Azerbaijan, it is one of the key issues, and I think that has to be recognised. But how you do that, how you stage that process, and what needs to happen when, and what language to be used is, I think that's all up for negotiation. And as I say, the Good Friday Agreement, took years in the making, quite frankly, and involved a lot of back-channel negotiations and discussions, and recognition that the only way forward was some sort of comprehensive agreement. So these things aren't easy, and I think we have to recognise that. And so it might come down to the staging in sense of what needs to happen at what particular point. And do you need X before you can then move to Y? So I think all of these are subject to negotiation. I mean, I would just say that, as you say, I'm not privy to negotiations, but previously Pashinyan has spoken about the need to change the constitution for wider reasons, and also recognising the fact that it does include this, apparently, this territorial claim. So I know he's been at pains to talk to the Armenian people and the population, the voters, about historical Armenia and current day Armenia. So it seems to me he is cognizant of that issue and the need to actually address it. So I think it's really a question of how you do that and when you do it, and also how, so it's not being too demanding and not being too public about it, and recognising that the need at the moment is to make progress and show you're making progress in negotiations, border delimitation and peace treaty negotiations, rather than suggesting that it's come to an impasse.
What we have noticed over the past few years that when Azerbaijan demands something and Armenia does not reciprocate in the way Azerbaijan believes Armenia should reciprocate, then next demand from Azerbaijan becomes even more sort of uncompromising. Recently, President Aliyev said that Azerbaijan and Armenia together should apply to OSCE in order to ensure that the OSCE Minsk group is no longer sort of alive. My feeling has always been that this organization is clinically dead, but it's still alive de jure, of course. And I wonder whether this will be an Azerbaijani condition which should be fulfilled before the peace treaty. To what extent you think this is a matter of vital criticality in the context of moving forward?
Personally, I was quite surprised. I mean, I know Azerbaijan's position on the Minsk group, and it's been like that ever since, well, particularly since 2020. But I was quite surprised to hear that request come out, because it doesn't, to me, seem particularly germane. I mean, everyone knows that the Minsk group is not operating for various reasons, both because Azerbaijan doesn't regard it as worthwhile, and also because the other countries involved, France and the United States, don't want to cooperate with Russia at the moment because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So there's a lot of reasons why the Minsk group is just dysfunctional right now, and that's fine. So no one's expecting it to suddenly come back to life. And as I say, the fact that negotiations between the two parties have now moved to bilateral basis just seems to be sort of fantastic news, really. And personally, I would just kind of leave the Minsk group sort of lying there, sort of, if you like, sort of very quiet and sort of sleeping or dormant, maybe not necessary. I don't personally think it's necessary to sort of take a position on it right now. And the wider OSCE will, obviously want to take a position on that. And I would have thought that they'd want to see, progress, or in fact finalisation of a peace agreement, and that would then be the kind of formal end, if you like, of the need for the Minsk group, because the act, when it was set up, of course, if you then have a peace treaty between Armenia and Azerbaijan, then that would then be the formal reason why you no longer need the Minsk group. And I would have thought the wider OSCE could then use that as the point at which they will then formally close it down, rather than before the peace treaty.
I mean, a common acquaintance, I believe, Orkhan James Morrison, a British journalist who's currently based in Tbilisi, I think recently stated that by being so demanding, Azerbaijan puts Prime Minister Pashinyan in a very difficult position, somewhat exacerbating his predicament. Do you think it's a valid comment? I mean, valid claim?
I think any public maximal demands are problematic in what is a very sensitive negotiation. And so both sides will make demands. I remember that Armenia was making various demands before, for example, before it started the border delimitation talks. For the first year or year and a half, it was demanding that Azerbaijani forces should withdraw. So I just think that's not particularly helpful. I think these things have to be negotiated sensitively, and it's best to do that rather than making public demands, because generally speaking, but particularly now, yes, I mean, Onik is correct that, of course, that Pashinyan's position is very, very sensitive and right now. So that's why, coming back to what I said earlier, that if the two sides can show some progress, even in border delimitation, which actually proves beneficial to Armenia's wishes. So if Azerbaijan then offered some to withdraw from some particular bit of disputed territory, for example, I don't know, things like that, just showing goodwill rather than demands, I think offers a much better way of taking negotiations forward.
My feeling is that Azerbaijan genuinely doubts the sincerity of Armenian government, and that's the reason why this OEC issue just cropped up, because the argument is that if you do not have a territorial claim against Azerbaijan, and this organization's mandate was about determining the status of that region, and because that issue is no longer there, perhaps we should disband it. That comes from that logic, I imagine. And
I don't actually think the formal mandate was to discuss the status, though, of the region. It was more just a conflict.
Yeah, and that issue is no longer on the agenda. And let's move into the connectivity agenda. So we have Nicole Pashinyan's Crossroads of Peace initiative, which looks very plausible, but probably lacks substance. And we have Azerbaijan's connectivity agenda with the Zangezur passage at the heart of it. President Aliyev recently stated that without Zangezur passage being opened, the whole business of opening of communication will not happen. So we've got this dichotomy between Baku and Yerevan. How do you see, how can these two sides achieve some kind of compromise solution regarding this matter?
Well, I think, again, you have to look at the bigger picture here. And I was speaking just earlier this week at a Caspian Policy Centre seminar here in London on the Middle Corridor. And of course, the Middle Corridor is sort of a big sexy issue at the moment for the Central Asian and Caucasus region. But I think it's very, very important for the countries of the region. I mean, as you know, the Middle Corridor originally was, the idea came up because people wanted to find a way of avoiding rail traffic going from China to Europe through Russia. And then, of course, the issues over the Red Sea, the Suez Canal closure, and the Red Sea problems in the Red Sea with the Yemenis, then led to further impetus being given to finding more routes from China, between China and Europe. But since then, of course, people have started to realise that actually it can then help promote connectivity, greater connectivity between the countries of the region, between the Central Asian and Caucasian countries. And on top of that, it can then help promote economic development, economic diversification in all of those countries. So I think that's now the lens through which people and institutions like the EBRD and World Bank are looking at the Middle Corridor. How do you then promote economic growth for the countries of the region? And it kind of feels to me that Azerbaijan is very, very well placed here. I mean, the president has talked a lot about the East-West and actually North-South. Azerbaijan is a sort of transit hub for both East-West and North-South traffic. And this really is about the East-West traffic, of course. But if you look at a map, all of the routes, this is something you've noticed very much, all of the routes converge on Alat, the port of Baku. So you may have three ports on the other side of the Caspian Sea, in Kurik and Aktau and Turkmenbashi, but there's only one on the western side. And then after Alat, the routes diverge again. So I think Azerbaijan is in a very, very good position to benefit from what's definitely going to happen, which will be the operationalization of the Middle Corridor. Well, it's operational already, of course, but I think the expansion of the Middle Corridor, I think, is very good news for Azerbaijan, and it will happen. The facilities, the capabilities will definitely be expanded, and then be many, many opportunities for economic diversification, to support the economic diversification agenda of Azerbaijan. And I think that's really, as I say, the bigger picture where the whole Nakhchivan link fits in. So it's not just about what was in the 2020 ceasefire agreement, where Armenia committed to allow, I think, unimpeded traffic between Azerbaijan, the different parts of Azerbaijan. It's now about that bigger picture, which is where the whole Armenian Crossroads of Peace fits in as well, I think. It's into that bigger picture. How do you diversify the routes? And so it's not just Baku to Tbilisi Kars rail line, but also the one that goes through down through towards Nakhchivan, through Ordubad, and then into Turkey from there. So that's really, I think, what's on offer. Azerbaijan recognises that, and I think Armenia sort of recognises that, definitely. But again, it's the sensitivities that they need to work through, I think, internally, in terms of under what conditions would Azerbaijani rail, road traffic and passengers pass between the different parts of Azerbaijan. That seems to be the stumbling block. And I would have thought, again, there are other places in the world which offer opportunities for, as precedents. I mean, of course, there's the Kaliningrad corridor, for example, is one. I mean, I'm not totally au fait with actually how that works, but nevertheless, that is another clear example of rail transit between different parts of one country. So maybe, so I think it's worth looking at those examples and just finding some sort of compromise solutions. And again, it comes back to what I said earlier about it's just important that both sides don't sort of set down a maximal demand or a maximal rejection. They just have to both recognise that this is actually in both of their interests, and therefore they just need to work quietly and consistently to find some sort of negotiated solution. Because negotiations always involve compromise, and I think both sides have to recognise that they both need to think about what compromises they can make.
Do you think the idea of the Russian control over the Zangezur passage is already out of the question now? I mean, as of June 2024.
Yeah, the Armenians are clearly trying to get the Russians to leave. I mean, I know that the Yerevan airport, they may have left already, I'm not quite sure. And then some of the Russian border troops on other borders, they're asking them to leave. So Armenia is clearly in a position whereby it's trying to sort of move away from any dependence or reliance upon Russian military and Russian forces. So again, it's understandable if Armenia wants to switch its orientation away from Russia towards the west, that strikes me as a good thing. So how you actually go about that then, I think is, again, there's some sensitivities. So I don't see. I know it says in the 2020 it talks about the 2020 ceasefire agreements. It talks about the Russian FSB overseeing the transport links. But again, other things have changed quite a lot since 2020. And I think that I think both sides again just need to look for some solution which recognises that Azerbaijan do have some legitimate concerns about how they might be treated in travelling between different parts of Azerbaijan, for example. So I think that these are both sides have legitimate concerns, and I just think just a way needs to be found to address both of those in the sort of a compromise way.
Since we mentioned the Russian influence in Armenia, recently Prime Minister Pashinyan said that our next step is going to be in the direction of leaving the CSTO. And what he said earlier was that, say, we have frozen our activities within that organization. He said that we could actually take some legal actions afterwards. But my feeling is that he has been somewhat vacillating regarding this matter. Do you think he will take that decisive action at some point this year regarding CSTO? Because it was a massive challenge, because it's not just about CSTO, bilateral Russian-Armenian relations, plus they are members of that organization called the Eurasian Economic Union. So how do you see their challenge to sort of reduce the Russian element?
Well, reducing the Russian element and leaving the CSTO, I think, are two different things.
Sure,
I mean, they can be a member of the CSTO without having Russian military bases or Russian border troops in Armenia. So if they genuinely want to move away from that reliance upon Russian troops, then I would have thought that has to be a stage-by-stage process. Do they need to leave the CSTO for that? Probably not. But if they want to do so, then I think I probably applaud that, quite frankly. I think that I would just say that I think sometimes that there've been I know there's been a lot of criticism in Armenia about the CSTO and its reaction or lack of reaction in 2020. But I think that at that time, the Russians and the CSTO were saying, well, this is a conflict which is taking place on Azerbaijani territory, and therefore the CSTO doesn't come into force. It doesn't come into play, if you like. And that was kind of a source of some dissension between Armenia and CSTO member states. 2023, again, I think the CSTO said, well, yes, we are committed to defending Armenian territory, but given that there's no border delimitation or demarcation agreed with Azerbaijan, and it's sort of slightly unclear to us where that border is. And again, that's a political judgment, and I wouldn't want to sort of take one side or the other on that. But I do understand both sides of that argument. So let's see how it goes. I don't have a close enough feel for Armenian domestic politics to know to what extent they will actually go through with pulling out of CSTO and the extent to which they can and will then get the Russians to remove all of their forces from Armenia.
You earlier mentioned about the bilateral negotiations over delimitation and demarcation of the interstate border. And what happened was absolutely critical. For the first time, Azerbaijan and Armenia agreed on something bilaterally without any mediator being involved. And that is incredibly encouraging. But we shouldn't we shouldn't finalize the process of delimitation and demarcation in order to sign a peace deal. Sort of, in your judgment, what sort of construct we have to develop at the time of signing a peace deal regarding the delimitation and demarcation? Sort of, what kind of consensus we have to reach by that time? Because Armenia insists that Almaty Declaration, latest maps. Azerbaijan is saying that Almaty Declaration is a very vague foundation. We accept it as a generic political foundation, but regarding each single section of the border, different maps emanating from different dates could be used, and we shouldn't sort of confine ourselves to a certain set of maps, some sort of vague Soviet maps. What is your reflection on that?
To be honest, I don't take a view at all on that question,
Okay.
because it's very, very, very much one for the two parties to agree on what the peace treaty should look like. I mean, all I would say is that clearly the two sides will not have finished border delimitation by the time they want to sign a peace treaty. Border delimitation, it can be very contentious. I mean, yes, they've got the maps, but nevertheless, in small areas, it can be quite contentious. I think a lot of it's quite clear. I think the two sides would agree it's quite clear. But in other areas, it can take time to actually resolve issues. I mean, I think the Azerbaijani-Georgian border isn't yet delimited and demarcated, for example. There is at least one dispute there. And there are many, many countries around the world you'll find they do not have agreed borders with neighbours. So it's something that can take quite a long time. And the extent to which they'll have made progress before the sign of the peace treaty, I think, is something that they'll have to decide amongst themselves.
Back to the conversation about Middle Corridor and Central Asia. After the restoration of sovereignty in Karabakh, Azerbaijan has developed this sort of concept of based on the idea that our geopolitical identity is very complex and fluid. So we are here in the South Caucasus, we are a Caucasian nation. In some ways, we are also a European nation. We are members of different European institutions. And also, we are a Turkic nation, of course, goes without saying. And also, we are somewhat Central Asian country, although we are not there geographically, but we are very much connected to that area. And you know that geography very well indeed. How do you evaluate Azerbaijan's efforts in terms of sort of, punching above its weight in the context of that strategic dialogue between 5 Central Asian countries, so that construct called 5+1?
Well, the Central Asian 5+1 means several things. I mean, the +1 can be Azerbaijan, or it can be the United States, or it can be the European Union.
In this case, I mean Azerbaijan.
Yeah, no, of course. But all I'm saying is that there's a sort of flexible format for the Central Asians to talk to other countries. But I think it's quite right and proper that Azerbaijan does have that dialogue with them. We talked about the Middle Corridor earlier, and it's clearly, if Central Asians want routes to Europe that don't involve going through Russia, and we've seen some of the issues with that previously, then they have to go through Azerbaijan, and they recognise that. And one thing I'll just add here, actually, about the Middle Corridor, is not just about rail transport and maritime transport, it's about fibre optic links as well. It's about aviation, even, with a lot of, the only gap now, the only route between Russia and Iran goes through Azerbaijan. It's about green energy. I know they've been talking and signing agreements to try to transport green energy through the Caspian and on to Europe, onto the Black Sea. And it's possibly about gas exports, additional gas exports as well, which has been one of the sort of long-standing questions about the whole issue of a Trans-Caspian gas pipeline from Turkmenistan. So there's a whole range of connectivity issues where Central Asia will definitely benefit from working with Azerbaijan and maybe some other Caspian states. But Azerbaijan, as I say, is kind of like the key to the whole of the Middle Corridor and all of these, all of the progress that can be made on these various connectivity issues. So, as I said, totally logical that they would want to talk to Azerbaijan. I mean, the other factor in this, of course, is the Organisation for Turkic States, which has been set up, maybe 2 years ago or so now. And again, that's an organisation which brings together not all of those countries. I think Tajikistan is not a member yet, so it might have observer status. But again, it kind of builds on those links between those countries. And for Central Asia, of course, sandwiched between, I suppose, Russia, Afghanistan, and China, then looking for new ways out, new opportunities for connectivity to the outside world. Again, clear advantages to working with Azerbaijan.
Indeed. I mean, also, I'd like to ask a couple of questions about COP29. I know this subject is very close to your heart. During our last conversation on the 23rd of April, if memory serves me correctly, you categorized all of those issues into three baskets. I think one basket was logistical issues, second one was substance-oriented matters, and third one was reputational issues. And 2 months on, have you seen tangible progress in those departments?
Well, I'm not in Azerbaijan, so I'm not
Yeah, sure.
really I'm not.
But you're following the developments.
Yeah, no, sure, but I'm not. What I mean is, I'm not really up to speed with the logistics side of it and the hosting.
Yeah.
What's going on there?
Yeah.
In terms of the, if you like, the negotiations, the sort of substance of COP29. Actually, just this last 2 weeks, there's been sort of the halfway conference has been taking place in Bonn, where I think the issues, as expected, have been it's been on finance, and everyone's looking at the replacement mechanism for this $100 billion per year that was pledged during the previous COP. So that's I think front and center stage of all of the discussions taking place, and then how much would go into this new fund, who would pay into it, who would benefit from it, what the conditionality might be, would it be loans or would it be grants? So there's a huge set of issues around that, but certainly everyone's still talking about this being the finance COP, if you like. But on top of that, there's also looking at is focused on things like the global stock take, which would be trying to measure progress towards targets. And this coming COP, they're not going to be looking to sign up to new emission reduction targets, but they will have to prepare for those for early 2025. So that will be something that's always in the background. But clearly it's going to be tough. There's going to be some tough negotiations in this coming COP. But Azerbaijan's doing well, I think. I mean, clearly I've seen there's Mukhtar Babayev and Yelchin Rafiev, I think, the chief negotiator.
Chief negotiator.
They've been traveling around the world and actually engaging, which I think that's a very, very important role for the COP presidency, is to engage and show engagement. Look, some of it's about public diplomacy, if you like, and just showing that you're listening to all the different opinions and taking them into account rather than just ignoring them, because all decisions that COP takes have to be by consensus. So you have to bring everyone with you. So that's a key part of the role. And I think they're doing that very well in terms of all the travel. And then you're being supported by the UN, of course, because technically it is a UN climate change summit with Azerbaijan hosting and chairing. So I think on that, in terms of, I've actually got 4 baskets now, I have to say. So my third basket now is, how can Azerbaijan use this to promote Azerbaijan and the region? What initiatives can you come up with that make it a regional COP, if you like, that get focused on coming back to Caspian and Central Asia and the Caucasus and environmental issues and the climate change issues that the countries face, particularly things like water shortage, and reducing rainfall, the reduction in the level of the Caspian Sea. All of these environmental questions, which may or may not be linked to climate change, I think are very germane. So I hope that I'd still like to see more evidence. Personally, I'd like to see more public evidence of what Azerbaijan's proposals are for to make it more of a regional COP. And then the fourth basket is, I think, what you mentioned is the third one, the handling of it. And it offers great opportunities for Azerbaijan to parade itself on the world stage and to get people to see what it's doing in Karabakh, what it's doing in terms of the drive for more renewable energy.
Recently been a Latvian climate action dialogue, which is part and parcel of that.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. No, so I saw that happen recently. And what Azerbaijan is doing in terms of its attractiveness to investment, coming back to what I was saying about the middle corridor and Alat and the opportunities there for Azerbaijan. And then the other side of the handling bit, of course, is the sort of what will the world media focus on? And we saw the Qatar 2022 World Cup is that they focused on things like LGBT rights, and they focused on the fate of construction workers. And so that's what particularly Western media comes and looks at. I think that's just a fact of life. You may decry it or not, but it's just, I think, something that Azerbaijan has to be aware of. So it's pretty obvious that they're going to focus on things like the arrest of the independent journalists, and also, I imagine, be looking at the fate of Armenian prisoners of war and things like that. So there are a range of sort of possible negatives, and I think that the key thing for Azerbaijan, of course, as with any country that's hosting these events, is to find ways to play up the positive and then sort of get rid of some of the negative possibilities that may come up as well.
The challenge is absolutely massive, but Azerbaijan does not look very daunted, which is a very good sign, of course. there's an argument developed by some people and articulated by them that oil and gas producer countries shouldn't host COP29. I mean, recently, I think a group of US Democrats appealed to White House officials saying that COP29 could be co-opted by the fossil fuel industry. What do you make of that argument? I mean, US, their footprint, carbon footprint is quite massive, and they're ramping up the oil production as well. And Azerbaijan's carbon footprint is relatively limited. Do you find any moral element in that argument when levied against Azerbaijan?
I saw that, and my first reaction was, that's a bit rich coming from the world's largest oil producer, which has been ramping up oil and gas production over the last few years. So yes, it was quite strange. It was quite a strange plea by a bunch of congressmen and women and senators, I think, to a Democratic president who was overseeing a massive oil and gas in the United States. I don't think that there's a particular morality that says that oil and gas producers should not host these things. I think, the counter, and yes, of course, the last 3 COPs have been hosted by oil and gas producers, and the next one will be, because let's not forget that Brazil, even though it's the sort of the protector, hopefully, of the sort of Amazon rainforest, which is absolutely key to help mitigate climate change, it is also a growing oil and gas producer. So we just have to accept that, and I think that my view. And it's, to a certain extent, is position we took as the United Kingdom, not as an oil and gas producer, but as a developed country which wanted to show leadership during COP26. We then felt that we had to actually go above and beyond to prove our credentials and to prove that we were a fit and proper chair of COP26. And therefore, we then committed ourselves to an even tougher emissions reduction targets, and then introduced a whole lot of new measures to actually show that actually we were showing leadership in the fight against climate change, and we weren't just expecting other people to do that. So I think that the thing about Azerbaijan hosting as an oil and gas producer is, I think it now needs to demonstrate that it recognises that oil and gas producers, hydrocarbons producers, do have a particular responsibility. Yes, it's the demand side as well as the supply side, and I think that's an important context which is often lost in this debate, is that there's only a supply of oil and gas because there's demand for it. So focusing on just on the supply side and condemning people for being oil and gas producers and hosting COPs, I just think is the wrong approach. I mean, it's a balanced approach, look at the supply side and the demand side. But as a hydrocarbons producer, and this was a point I made in lead up to COP26 when I was ambassador, was it's incumbent upon oil and gas producers to show leadership and have even tougher what's called nationally determined contributions, i.e. emission reduction targets. So I think that Azerbaijan, probably my view is that it needs to recognise that and show that actually it is demonstrating leadership. And I think the other point about having oil and gas producers as chair of COPs, and I recognise this is a theoretical, but you would hope that they would then be better placed to convince other oil and gas producers that they have to sort of collectively do something to reduce production. Did that happen in Dubai? I'm not so sure. But nevertheless, as I said, I think that's the theoretical. That's been the theoretical moral pressure, I think, that would and should be put on oil and gas producers. You need to, we are showing confidence by giving you chairmanship of this process, and therefore we expect you to show leadership.
Sure. And my last question is going to be about, if I may, about the next general election take place in the UK. I know, despite the fact that you're a former diplomat, I'm absolutely sure you are absolutely disinclined to comment on British body politics, and that's not going to be my question. Don't worry about that. But it is widely expected that Labour landslide is very much guaranteed, and Tories are set to lose. My question is very simple and basic. Could we expect any policy shift in the British approach to the South Caucasus in general and Azerbaijan in particular, in the light of what is likely to happen in early July?
As a general point, I would say, as having someone that's worked in the Foreign Office for quite a long time, you don't see much difference between the parties when it comes to foreign policy. And generally, foreign policy does not play a role in general elections in the United Kingdom. I mean, this may sound strange given we have Brexit, but even our relationship with the European Union was not a factor in previous general elections, and only became an issue for various reasons, various political reasons. So normally when you have a new government come in of the opposition party, things don't change that much. It's often around the edges or around the nuances, if you like. I remember when the Labour government came in, they were talking about ethical foreign policy and much more values-based. And I think that kind of ran up against a bit of a brick wall of reality, if you like. But that's always a dilemma for any party. It's the, how do you define your international interests? And of course, you have values which you want to bring to the international arena, but equally you have a whole range of interests, whether they be security interests or prosperity interests. And you kind of have to, foreign policy is always a balance between your different interests. And I think because of that, we tend to find that parties don't tend to have very, very, very dissimilar positions on foreign policy issues. I mean, I'm not aware of anything that's been discussed about Central Asia or the Caucasus or Azerbaijan in particular. And I think what's interesting is the whole role of oil and gas production, even possibly in Britain, has gone backwards since I was in Azerbaijan, when we will not support oil and gas investment overseas, and we will not issue new licenses and this sort of stuff. But then certainly the current government has taken a step away from its position in terms of issuing more licenses, and that's now a bit of an issue, if you like, particularly in Scotland for the general election, the extent to which the parties should continue to support oil and gas exploration and production in the North Sea. So we're kind of in a slightly different place now than we were a few years ago for COP26, I think, in the UK. So I don't think we're quite as doctrinaire about oil and gas issues. Sometimes the parties or the positions, government's positions on different issues may come down to who's foreign secretary, who's a junior minister. So it may come down to personal interest and personal connections. And so I think we just have to see who wins election, which, as you say, kind of looks fairly much like a foregone conclusion. But who then becomes foreign secretary and who become junior ministers, and whether or not any of those come with any particular connections and any particular views on these issues. So that would be the main determinant rather than a specific policy shift.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I'm most grateful to you, and thanks again. All the best.
My pleasure. Always a pleasure. Thank you.